this on campus somewhere? Is that right?
Which one?
The Humanities Festival?
Yes.
Good evening, everyone. Welcome to Medill. Thank you for coming out on a not too bad winter night to be with us this evening. I am very pleased to welcome two of our very own tonight. We're very proud that these folks are both Medill faculty. And our moderator this evening is Alex Kotlowitz. You may all know Alex from the many books he's written. Most recently, An American Summer, Love and Death in Chicago. And then a national bestseller a number of years ago, There Are No Children Here, which the New York Public Library selected as one of the 150 most important books of the 20th century. And most recently, Alex has been named one of Chicago Magazine's Chicagoans of the Year. So we're very proud of all of his accomplishments and really happy that he's here. And he was very nice to offer to moderate this discussion with Debbie Cenzpier. So Alex, I'll let you take it from here.
Great. So,
Thanks.
Yeah, so it's, as Debbie said, it's a small but mighty crowd. Oh,
Yeah.
Sorry.
Got it? Great.
Can you hear me now? There, great. Thanks, sorry about that. As Debbie said, this is a small but mighty crowd. Well, first of all, it's a thrill to be here with Debbie. We have not met before, and I had not read Debbie's work until this book, and I was given it on a Friday and had devoured it within a matter of a couple of days. It's really a masterpiece of storytelling, of narrative, and I want to talk a little bit about, because it's a kind of unusual structure in the book, and we'll get to that in a bit. But for those of you who don't know Debbie worked at the Miami Herald, where she won a Pulitzer for her investigations into, if I'm not mistaken, corruption in the public housing, of which I'm deeply familiar, and then spent many years at the Washington Post, and of course is now here as director of the investigative reporting at Medill. So Debbie, welcome. So this is a book, Citizen 865, that I think you've talked about this, which is a book about this incredibly dark period in our history, and yet the book itself doesn't feel particularly dark. And so for me, it's one of the real accomplishments of this work, is to be able to look at a period like that and sort of find a sense of hope, a sense of light in it. And I want to just ask you a little bit about how you found your way to this story, because it is a remarkable story. Yeah.
That cannot begin to tell you how much that means to me coming from you, so thank you. Definitely a highlight of my short time at Medill to be talking to you tonight, so thank you for being here. So I was at a cocktail party in the suburbs of Maryland just final few moments of 2016. And there was disco music playing in the background, and my husband was desperate to leave, motioning toward the door because he thought I was going to force him to dance, which he was dreading. And I fell into a conversation with a Department of Justice lawyer who started to describe the work of the tiny unit inside the Justice Department that had spent the better part of 30 years hunting for Nazi war criminals who slipped into the United States after the war. And I was fascinated by it because I remember thinking, how was it possible that there were still Nazi war criminals, collaborators, murderers, living in the United States more than 70 years after the war? How was that even possible? And more than that, I was really interested in knowing the people inside the Justice Department that had spent their entire professional careers living inside these dark moments, hunting these men down, talking not just to victims and to witnesses, but also to murderers, to mass murderers, who describe mass murder in such clinical terms. How is it possible for people to do that work during the day and then go home at night to their children and their husbands and their wives? And I really wanted to tell their story.
Yeah, well, I think one of the things that's remarkable about the book is the sense of intimacy. I've got to say, as an aside, that the idea that you got the idea for this book in 2016 and finished it in a couple of years, if only. Yeah, I mean, I think one of the interesting parts of this book is that OSI, it didn't even come into existence until the 1970s, right? I mean, long after the war, and the result, if I remember right, Congressman Holtzman, right, and yet it was also very controversial. I mean, it's one of the things, there are these moments in the book when, in the guise of Pat Buchanan, who was Reagan's press secretary, who takes on OSI and says, what are you doing? These, they're out there looking for Nazi and Nazi collaborators who have come to this country, most of whom are now old, and Buchanan sort of goes on a tear about why are you going after these elderly people? Can you talk a little bit about that opposition to this notion of finding justice some 30, 40, 50 years later?
Yeah. I mean, that is one of the things that surprised me most, is that there was pushback. You would think they're hunting down Nazi war criminals. What's the problem? But they faced not just pushback from people like Pat Buchanan and other conservative commentators, they also faced pushback from judges who were several generations removed from the war. Why are you going after these men, little old men, ordinary old men? These are people who had really never seen the inside of an American courtroom before. No traffic tickets. They were living quiet lives. They had become naturalized citizens. They had vowed to defend the Constitution. They were collecting Social Security checks, pensions. They had American wives, American children, settling into a peaceful retirement. And so it was a controversial thing to go after them and to basically say, so many years after the end of the war, you shouldn't be living here.
And this is a book that focuses very specifically on the sort of uncovering of this really kind of, until recently, reasonably unknown part of the Nazi operations, this camp Treblinka, is that how you pronounce it? Yeah, Treblinka in Poland, which was a place, if I understand right, that actually trained the guards who ended up going out and exterminating the Jews in Poland. And this is the book revolves around the story of one individual, Jacob Reimer, who's actually got an interesting history. So he was a Soviet soldier who becomes a German POW, and because he speaks German, the Germans come to him and say, "We need you to help." Yeah. Was that unusual that they?
They actually pulled a lot of Soviet POWs out to work for them, but basically the backstory is that the SS decided through a plan called Operation Reinhard, secret plan to murder the Jews of occupied Poland. Well, there were many Jews living in occupied Poland, millions of Jews, and they needed manpower. They couldn't rely on German soldiers. They were busy fighting on the Soviet front, so they needed boots on the ground. They needed people. Mass murder is hard work. It takes a lot of people. And so they ended up recruiting men like Jacob Reimer, pulling people from Soviet POW camps, captured Soviet soldiers, as well as Eastern European civilians. And they sent them to this little tiny village, a farming village called Travniki, south of Warsaw. And there the SS set up a training camp. They armed these men, they trained them, they deployed them. Travniki was, in every sense, a school for mass murder. They trained 5,000 men there, including Jacob Reimer, and then they deployed these men across occupied Poland on some of the dirtiest, most brutal missions in occupied Poland. They emptied the Jewish ghettos. They worked the gas chambers and the death camps in occupied Poland, and they conducted shooting operations. Without Jacob Reimer and his 5,000 comrades who served as Travniki men, there's no way the SS could have killed so many people so quickly. Eventually, they killed 1.7 million Jews in fewer than 20 months, which is the span of 2 Polish summers.
I mean, you don't talk about this much in the book, but for me, one of the things that it certainly provoked was this notion that somebody like Jacob Reimer, who was actually fighting the Nazis, at some point becomes a collaborator. And though he, till his death sort of suggested that he had no choice because he had been a POW, but he clearly at some point finds his way to believe just as the Nazis do, and so it was this notion that that people, even from the outside who came into this world, sort of found themselves very much a part of it.
Very much so. And at Travniki, they were indoctrinated. I mean, there were reports that they were armed and forced to shoot a Jew to prove loyalty to the SS. Some men did desert Travniki. They didn't want to be part of the operation. But Jacob Reimer and 5,000 others faithfully stayed on. He was given 4 service medals, paid vacations. He left to go find his family in Ukraine, returned on his own, unescorted.
And they give him citizenship in Germany.
And he was
Yeah.
given, he was given citizenship in 1944 in Nazi Germany, which meant that he would have lived in Nazi Germany as a decorated war hero.
And so he ends up coming here and becomes a potato chip salesman. That's sort of what...
Wise potato chip salesman. He blended into New York City and became a wise potato chip salesman. Other Travniki men came here too. One became a Ford Motor company, worked for Ford Motor, John Demjaniuk, some of you might know his name. One worked for the Cracker Jack Company right here in Chicago. There were a number of these men who slipped into the United States after the war.
So part of this book is, for me, kind of a procedural book. I mean, you're sort of inside these kind of detectives at OSI. I mean, they're not really, they're prosecutors and historians who are trying to sort of uncover the mystery behind Travniki and also trying to prove that Reimer, in fact, was a collaborator. But there's also this parallel story going on in this book about this lovely... it's kind of a love story between these two individuals, Felix and Lucinda, who both come from Lublin, the town where that was decimated by the Nazis. Can you talk about what your decision to have these kind of parallel stories? Because they never really quite intersect with each other.
Which is, yes. And I hate that they didn't totally intersect as a writer.
It works
fine.
fine.
I wanted them so badly to intersect. They didn't, but that's true. They didn't. So Lucinda and her husband Felix were just teenagers during the war. They were friends. They were not boyfriend and girlfriend. They lived in this little town called Lublin, which had 40,000 Jews before the war. Fewer than 200 survived, including Felix and Lucinda. And the way they survived is when the Travniki men came in to liquidate their ghetto, killing everyone they ever knew or deporting them to one of the killing centers, they hid in a double door, in the wall, and they stayed there as long as they could, and then they slipped out of Lublin and went to Warsaw. And where do you go in Warsaw if you're 2 Jews in the middle of the night in occupied Poland? They went into the Jewish ghetto. And for whatever reason, right before the uprising, where they surely would have been killed or deported, they got out of the ghetto and managed to survive the war. They married in the Warsaw ghetto under the cover of night. In fact, one of my favorite scenes from the book is Lucy didn't have a wedding ring. They were in the Warsaw ghetto. So this woman came up, pulled the wedding ring off of her own finger, handed it to 16-year-old Lucy and said, "You take it, maybe it will bring you better luck." And they survived the war, went back to Lublin, realized that no one that they knew had survived. They eventually came to the United States in, I think, 1950. And in 1951, Jacob Reimer came over to the United States 1 year after Felix and Lucy did.
No, it's an extraordinary story, and you do such a beautiful job, which I want to talk about in a bit, about sort of recreating that. Can you talk a little bit about your decision to include that story alongside the story of the OSI? Yeah.
I mean, I didn't, this is a detective, it's a book that reads like a detective story, I think, but there were people here. There were people who were impacted. It's humanity. It's this love story. It's this incredible journey of 2 survivors. And I remember when I first heard their history, they had recorded it. They had tapes. I'd never met Felix and Lucy, but I've come to know their children and grandchildren. I remember sitting at my desk all alone in my house. My husband and kids were asleep, and I was up until 2 in the morning. I could not stop until I heard their story. It was that incredible to me.
And can you talk a little bit about how, because by the time you came to this story, Felix and Lucy were deceased, and a couple of members of OSI were no longer alive. Can you talk about going back and trying to, because there are these beautiful moments. I mean, one of the things that I love about this book is it goes back and forth in time, and so part of it is contemporary, as the OSI is trying both to find Jacob Reimer and then prove, in fact, that he was a collaborator. And then the other part of the book is going back during the war, as we spend our time with Felix and Lucy, and also some time in Travinki as well, yeah, so.
Yeah, I mean, this book spans 70 years, and that was not easy. You know, you think you can write about history, but I've learned from writing about history that it's not enough to know what happened between 1939 and 1945. You have to know what happened decades before and decades after. So I had to do a lot of reporting, essentially, and I went to Europe, retraced the steps of Felix and Lucinda.
But how did you even know what their steps were?
Because they spent hours telling their stories on camera, and I got those tapes. So that's how I knew their story.
And telling them for somebody who was preserving
Yes.
Holocaust stories.
Yes. And so I got a copy of the tapes. I met their families, flew to meet their children, their grandchildren. I'm still in touch with their families. We've become friends. So I had their words, so I could quote them. I could hear the emotion, and it was unbelievable. But I didn't just retrace the steps of Felix and Lucy or Lucinda. I also retraced the steps of the historians who went to the archives across Eastern Europe to track down men like Jacob Reimer. And my favorite scene in this book is when the two lead historians went to Prague just after the collapse of communism. So many Nazi records were stashed in the archives of communist countries, and communist governments wouldn't let Western historians in to look for information. They finally got permission to go to Prague. So a couple of historians land in Germany. They rent a car that chugs its way across Germany. They come into Prague in the middle of the night, check into their apartment. One of them is a woman named Barry White. She's 3 months pregnant. Their Soviet caretaker looks at Barry and insists that she eat pork cutlets and beer for breakfast. Poor Barry does not want pork cutlets and beer, and she is definitely sick. So they end up going to the archives the next morning in a government sedan with officers with pistols latched on their hips. And the main historian is a guy named Peter Black. So through an interpreter, surrounded by government agents with pistols, Peter Black says, "My name is Peter Black, and this is Barry White." You got my punchline. We're here representing the U.S. Department of Justice. Well, of course, all of the agents smirk in the room, thinking that the CIA has no imagination. These must be spies. What kind of names are these? But in fact, they were there representing the Department of Justice, and in the basement, in the dusty archives, Barry White, several hours later, pushes back her chair, takes a piece of paper over to Peter and says, "I found something." And what she found was a Nazi roster from 1945 that listed the names of 700 Travniki men, including several who they knew were living in the United States. One of them was Jacob Reimer, citizen 865. And so I was able to go to that archive and find the original Nazi roster that they found in 1990. So for me, that was an exceptionally interesting moment.
And did you go back there by yourself, or did you go back with, I don't know if Peter and Black and Barry White are still alive.
They very much are.
Yeah, so
yes.
did you go back with them?
No.
Or no?
I could have, but I didn't. No, but I did go back with the team of interpreters and scholars who helped me figure this out. Yeah. Yeah, they make you put white gloves on because they don't want the oil on your fingers to touch historical documents. And it was like touching a piece of history. That discovery in 1990 was this turning point in this investigation. Historians in the West knew that this school for mass murder existed, but they didn't understand who had served there, what they were doing, what its role was, what Travniki's role was in the mass murder of Poland's Jews. And so the Department of Justice and the historians spent more than 20 years investigating Travniki, what this training camp was and who served there, and then tracking these men down on U.S. soil. There were about 16 of them.
And you were just telling me outside that there's actually recent news about Travniki that we've just learned just in the past week.
Yeah, just 2 days ago, I wrote a story for the Washington Post. One of the killing centers, I don't know if you guys, I didn't know this, the difference between a concentration camp and a killing center. Concentration camps had barracks, forced labor. People were generally kept alive there for a little bit, at any rate. Death camps were built solely for death. Jews were taken off the trains. They were made to undress, turn over their valuables, and within moments they were taken to the gas chambers. The 3 killing centers staffed or manned by the Travniki men were in occupied Poland. One was called Sobibor, and it's 167,000 Jews were gassed there in 17 months, largely because of the Travniki men who staffed Sobibor. There were no photos of Sobibor, or only 2 photos of Sobibor that existed in the archival record until now, because the Nazis bulldozed the camp at the end of the war to hide evidence of mass murder. So we didn't have photos, but historians in Berlin unearthed 350 photos of Sobibor that were kept in the attic, in the cupboards, and 2 photo albums of the deputy commandant of the camp. And so that made international news because we finally got to see what Sobibor looked like.
Have you seen the photos? Or?
Can I show them to you?
Please,
real
oh,
quick?
yeah, please.
Okay. If I can work
That
this.
wasn't a setup, by the way. That was
But that's assuming I can work this, which is,
Jacob Reimer, did you find him?
no.
Yeah.
Jacob Reimer. Oh, Catherine, are you there, Catherine? Let's see if I can find this. Hold on. Yep, I got it. So this is the entrance to the Sobibor death camp. And what's interesting about it, you see the branches stuffed in the fence. That was because they wanted it to look like this mundane, nothing bad could happen there. It looked like a quaint farm. And so they put a brush in the fence so that nobody could see inside. But really, just a little bit away were the gas chambers. And so a number of pictures of Travniki men showed up in these photos, and this is one of them, including, have you guys heard of John Demjanjuk? He's known, right, for Ivan the Terrible, which we now know he wasn't, but John Demjanjuk served in Sobibor, and John Demjanjuk was a Travniki man, so Travniki was his base of operations. That's the place that he was trained and deployed. Historians believe that man in the center of the front is John Demjanjuk. Some of the historians in Berlin believe that. We're not sure that it actually is. So these are the photos that just came out this week, and the photos show a lot of men from Travniki. What I found most fascinating, quickly, is that it didn't show the killing operation, but it showed life in this camp. These are the deputy commandants in the middle, some women having a good time, sipping drinks with crystal and glasses that they probably took from the luggage of their Jewish victims. It's amazing to me that they could sit and carouse and drink and do all of those things when during the day, not too far from where they were sitting, there were gas chambers. So that's the story of Sobibor that just came out this week.
Can I ask a personal question? You had mentioned that part of what drew you to the story was this idea that these people from OSI, these prosecutors and historians, that they had to live with these incredibly dark stories, and they had families. And what was it like for you?
That is a great question. I'm not sure how to answer that. It was dark, it's dark, especially, we're human beings, and it's hard to read about this and hear about this. To me, reading depositions, reading interviews with killers, the way they describe mass murder in such clinical terms, it was hard to listen to. It really was. But putting that aside, I was so moved by the people in this book. I really wanted to know, especially the historians. That fascinated me, that they could dig in the archives in Eastern Europe and find records that no one had ever seen before. As an investigative reporter, I was like, sign me up, that's great. And they were able to basically find this unexplored sliver of history and correct and expand the record of history. And I was really, really interested in that.
And what was it like when you went back to Lublin? Are there any Jews there now, or?
Not a lot.
Right.
Not a lot of Jews in Poland. I think I saw an estimate of 4,000. Poland is, it was a wounded country. I found it to be a wounded country. And walking the Jewish ghetto in Poland was eerie. Right. It was eerie, especially because I knew what went on there.
Right. Yeah, my family's from Poland, and I always remember we went back to my grandfather's hometown, and for me, I mean, one, there's still a great deal of anti-Semitism
Very much
in
so.
the country, but it's also interesting that you're a Pole or you're a Jew. You know, they still sort of think about those in separate terms. Yeah.
No, very much
Yeah,
so.
yeah.
Yeah, it was interesting. I'm going to just move this so I can show you these other pictures in case it comes up. Sorry. Yeah.
So, Debbie, I thought maybe what we could do before we open it up for questions is maybe you could just read a sliver from your book, if you would.
Yeah.
You say you
No,
haven't
I
done
would be
this
happy
before.
to. I've never once read from my book. Now, in all the speaking engagements I've been doing, not one time.
Yeah. So I would actually, so one of the things I sometimes love is when the interviewer reads, but I'm not feeling so great, so I don't think I would do a particularly good job, but I did pick a section, if
Okay.
that's okay. So, and I think this may be the first time, I don't know if it's the first time we meet Felix and Lucinda, but maybe you could set that up, but it's these 2 pages right here.
Oh, yeah. So Felix and Lucinda, as I said, they lived in Lublin, Poland. And if I may, these are pictures of the Jewish ghetto in Lublin. Lublin in Poland, I don't know if anyone knows Lublin, it was this thriving cultural hub. Jewish life was very vibrant there. Jewish people held spots on town council. They were business owners. It was just this thriving hub of Jewish life. And in 1941, they were forced into a Jewish ghetto. 40,000 people in this ghetto that was, disease and starvation and all the horrible things that we know happened. Until one night, the men of Travniki surrounded the perimeter of the ghetto, lighted the street lamps outside, ordered everyone outside, and said 1,500 people a day would be deported east, resettled east, and to line up. And so over a period of a couple of weeks, they deported nearly all of the 40,000 people living in Lublin to the first killing center to open in occupied Poland, where they were gassed upon arrival. The Travniki men also went to the Jewish orphanage, and they killed not only the children, but their non-Jewish caregivers who refused to abandon the children. They stayed there and were shot by the men of Travniki. They also went to the Jewish hospital, and they murdered the doctors and the nurses and the patients. And then the Travniki men went all over occupied Poland to liquidate all of the ghettos and serve in the death camps. In fact, the Travniki men served side by side with the Germans to suppress the Jewish uprising in the Warsaw Ghetto, which is where this piece picks up. Travniki was so important to the leadership that Heinrich Himmler visited the Travniki camp on several occasions to salute the men. And these are the Travniki men in the Warsaw Ghetto, very much fighting alongside the Germans. And so where this chapter picks up is where Felix and Lucy end up inside the Warsaw Ghetto. They don't know where else to go.
Because they fled Lublin.
They fled Lublin, yes. They were among the last Jews to survive, in part because Lucy's father worked in the ghetto administration. So he managed to keep them alive, and the way he got them out was he bribed a couple of officers, Ukrainian officers, to let them run for their lives, figuring at least they might have a shot if they could run for their lives, and that's what they did. is one of the things that did strike me in writing this book is Felix often asked himself later in life, how was it that I survived and so many didn't? You know, what did I do? Was I better or was I smarter? You know, was I quicker on my feet? And he ultimately decided he was just plain lucky. He was just plain lucky. It was fate. It was chance. It was nothing but fate and chance. So when Felix and Lucinda get to Warsaw, they also had Lucinda's little brother named David. So you want me to read the first little? So Felix, Lucinda, and David ducked out of the railway station in Warsaw a few hours after midnight, chins down, shoulders hunched, praying they could pass for Aryans in a city on the hunt for Jews. The streets were nearly deserted, lighted only by the moody orange glow of street lamps. Felix was grateful for the darkness. They made a suspicious trio, a man of 22, traveling with a 16-year-old girl and a boy of only 9, no luggage, no parents. Felix flagged down a rickshaw driver. There was a hotel in city center where Felix had heard that Jewish families were hiding from the Gestapo. Would there be space for the three of them? The possibility of being turned away was terrifying. They were 180 kilometers from home, and Felix barely knew his way around Warsaw. He glanced at Lucinda and David, shivering in the night air. How brave Lucinda had been, sitting with her brother on the train as it sped into the night, away from everything she had ever known. They had made their way to Warsaw with a few coins that Lucinda's father had tucked into the pocket of her coat as he urged her to flee the ghetto with David and Felix. Only a few days had passed, but to Felix it felt like a lifetime, when he had a mother, father, and sister, and the dull hope that they would somehow survive together in the last Jewish settlement of Lublin. After a single night in the gardener's basement, Felix, Lucinda, and David had trudged along icy streets to Lucinda's old apartment building in the center of Lublin, where a Polish neighbor who ran a laundry business had agreed to hide the family's silver and artwork. Before the war, the neighborhood had been one of Lublin's poshest, with grand apartment houses painted pink and green and yellow bouquets of poppy flowers in window boxes and doorways. The area had suffered heavy bombing during the German invasion, targeted for its concentration of government offices, and Felix, Lucinda, and David walked slowly on streets strewn with concrete and glass. Lucinda slipped inside the building while Felix and David watched from the street. "My God," her old neighbor said, gaping at Lucinda from the doorway. "Where are your parents?" Lucinda struggled to find the words to describe all that had happened, why her cheeks were hollow and her insides felt numb, why she was suddenly terrified to ask for help from a neighbor who had known Lucinda since she was a 4-year-old in knee socks and hair ribbons. She pushed out the words, "Can I please have one of the candelabras so that I can sell it and find my way to Warsaw?" "It's all in the attic," her neighbor had answered. "Come back at 2 o'clock and I'll have everything ready." Lucinda saw a flash of hesitation on the woman's face. It was there and then gone, like the faintest crackle of fallen leaves under footsteps that send hunted animals running. Something didn't feel right. Lucinda raced outside, breathless, and hid with Felix and Lucy behind a nearby building with a clear view of the apartment house. Soon, 2 officers, Gestapo officers, drove up and rushed inside.
Well, thank you. I mean, the book, as you can see, is a triumph of reporting and of storytelling. I mean, I don't think there's any better sales job than just listening to this short portion. So,
Yeah, thank you
yeah.
for saying that.
So, can we open it?
Lucinda, I should tell you, and her little brother David, right before the Nazi invasion of Poland in 1939.
This is
That's Lucinda, yeah. And her brother David managed to survive in Warsaw. And then Lucinda and David heard one day that the Nazis had agreed to swap a bus full of Jewish children with German prisoners, and the children would be heading to Switzerland on a bus. And she didn't know what to do because David had to hide all day long in the walls of this apartment complex that they were living in because Jewish children, Jewish boys, and Jewish men could be identified. Sometimes they were told, honestly, to drop their pants. And so this little boy had to hide in the walls all day. He was malnourished, he was hungry. And so she put her brother on that bus, watched the bus leave, and found out later through the Polish underground that it was a trick and that all the children were taken to a concentration camp in Germany. And that was the last time Lucinda saw David, her brother.
And I'm curious, and then we can open up for questions. Did they pass these stories on to their children? I mean, when you came along, were there things they learned from you, or had they already known the entire story?
That's such a good question. They didn't know the story. They knew parts of it. They had never watched the tapes of their parents. They're the children of survivors, and they couldn't bear to listen.
They knew they existed.
Very much so.
Oh, wow.
They knew they existed but hadn't watched the tapes. It was just too heart-wrenching for them to listen to these stories of their mother and father. So I think one day they'll watch the tapes, and Lucy put the tapes away for her children in hopes that they would one day, but they had not seen the tapes.
Have they read the book, do you know?
They've read the book. Oh yeah, they've read the book. But no, and it was hard for them. But, it's a story that needed to be told. And it's a story, I should tell you, with a happy ending, which is, you talked about this being a story about hope. I mean, besides the fact that there were men who were brought to justice, not just the men of Travniki, but more than 100 Nazi collaborators living in the United States were identified by this tiny unit inside the Justice Department, despite widespread pushback both here and abroad. They were able to bring to justice and ultimately denaturalize and deport well over 100 men in recent years who had served the Third Reich. Felix and Lucy lived well into their 90s, and Felix died first. I can show you some of this, but Felix died first. He died peacefully in his armchair, I think watching an ice hockey game. And Lucinda told their children, I will not live 6 more months without him. And I remember, I always tear up, but I remember thinking, well, why is that? And then I realized that the only person who remembered Lucy's family was Felix. And the only people that remembered Felix's family was Lucy. They had this powerful pull of shared memory. Felix later in life used to say to Lucy, I can't remember what my sister's voice sounded like. I wish I could still hear his voice. And so, true to her word, after her husband died, Lucinda died 6 months later on what would have been the 75th wedding anniversary of their wedding in the Warsaw Ghetto. And they left behind a whole family, 14 people.
Yeah, I mean, I suspect you can't answer this, but I wonder whether they ever talked about that experience, about their journey. Whether it was sort of kind of understood that this is part of the past and not to be revisited, or whether they together ever talked about it.
Felix talked about it for years. In fact, where this story does meet up a little bit is that Felix learned later in life that Nazi collaborators were living on U.S. soil, and that frustrated him. He got very angry. He would say to his son, how is this possible? How are these men here living side by side with Holocaust survivors and their families? Lucinda didn't talk about it as much until later in life, and once her children were grown and out of the house, she felt she had an obligation to tell her story.
One last question before you open it up to questions, and that is, does the OSI still exist?
So the Office of Special Investigations was launched in 1979. When they started, they figured they'd have 2 to 5 years. I mean, after all, how many Nazi perpetrators could be living in the United States? The unit lasted for more than 30 years. In fact, they denaturalized and deported more Nazi criminals than all other countries in the world combined since 1990, including Germany. And the unit was merged a few years ago inside the Justice Department with a broader unit with a post-World War II mission to search for war criminals from other hotspots around the world, Rwanda, Guatemala, Bosnia, and they are just as busy as they've ever been.
So let's open it up to questions. somebody back.
After hearing Elizabeth Holtzman, who was at the Holocaust Museum, and hearing her story, and how much of your book is, or how much of the story, or what did you have to say about her?
So Elizabeth Holtzman is in the book, and Elizabeth Holtzman, without Elizabeth Holtzman, this unit would not have probably existed. So the history is after the war, Immigration and Naturalization Services, INS, was charged with hunting war criminals on U.S. soil, but there wasn't a lot of teeth behind it. There wasn't a lot of will behind it. We were fighting the Cold War. Jewish communities in the United States didn't want to make a big deal out of this right after the war. And it's only until the 1970s, when Elizabeth Holtzman got involved, that this unit was not only created, but moved inside the criminal division of the Justice Department. So it had real teeth to it. And one of the reasons she pushed to create this unit is because Simon Wiesenthal got a tip in Israel about a woman living in Queens, New York, who had served in the Majdanek concentration camp in occupied Poland. And they called her at the time the stomping mare because she had spikes on the bottom of her jack boots. And she used to kick and maim and kill children with them in the Majdanek concentration camp. And after the war, she married a PI, an American soldier, and was a housewife living in Queens until American investigators realized she was here. And that just made her and many other people very angry. And that's when Elizabeth Holtzman pressed Congress to not only create this unit, but to move it inside the criminal division of the Justice Department, where it's been ever since.
And I'm proud to say that Elizabeth Holtzman was my city council person when I was growing up in New York before she was in Congress. So
Oh, it's very interesting. Elizabeth Holtzman, I should say, had been involved for years in OSI. Remember, they faced incredible pushback from Pat Buchanan and other people, and not just from Pat Buchanan, but from judges, because some of the evidence that this unit used came from the Soviet Union. And so how can we possibly trust evidence from the Soviet Union, especially the height of the Cold War? So judges really pushed back, and Elizabeth Holtzman was there, especially in the early years, every step of the way. The pushback this unit faced didn't just come from people at home, it also came from Germany and Austria, because Germany and Austria did not want to take back Nazi perpetrators living on US soil. And that was an ongoing frustration to the people inside this unit. Here they worked so hard over many years to denaturalize people who shouldn't have been here in the first place, and then take them to immigration court and get a judge to order them removed from US soil. But you can't just send someone somewhere. Another country has to agree to it. And for many years, Germany and Austria refused to take back Nazi perpetrators that they had armed, trained, deployed. And so one of the stories in the book, one of the worst, saddest things in the book was a lawyer named Michael Bernstein, who was one of the savviest, most successful lawyers in this department. He was 36 years old in December 1988. And Michael had 2 children, lived in Bethesda, Maryland, and got word that Austria was finally relenting, that they would take back Nazi perpetrators found in the United States. So the Justice Department sent him to Austria to get the deal signed. This was a huge breakthrough for the Justice Department. So Michael Bernstein kissed his wife and son goodbye, went to Austria, got the deal signed, decided he wanted to get home to celebrate Hanukkah with his family, and with the signed agreement in his briefcase at the last minute switched flights, and he ended up on Pan Am Flight 104, which, as we know, blew up over Lockerbie, Scotland, by a terrorist bomb that was wrapped in baby clothes and planted inside a Samsonite suitcase. So Michael died essentially in the line of duty, 30 plus years after the end of the war, trying to convince Austria to take back Austrian-born Nazi perpetrators.
Debbie, what was the reason that Germany and Austria didn't want to take any of the Nazi perpetrators back?
Yeah, I think there's all kinds of technical reasons. Lack of witnesses, doesn't meet our criminal guidelines. It came down, I think, to a lack of political will and just a sense that they were done, so many years after the end of the war, they were done. We all know about the Nuremberg trials, right? We all know that, big famous trials, but in reality, thousands and thousands of lower level collaborators escaped justice. There was no accountability. Think about how many thousands of people it would take on the ground to murder 6 million plus people. And so many people went back to their lives. I mean, even right after the war, Jacob Reimer, this is Jacob Reimer. This is his SS photo. And right on his breast pocket is his Nazi-issued SS number, which was 865. And he carried that number throughout the war. But right at the end of the war, he ditched his uniform, he ditched his identification papers, and he went to Munich and actually worked for the army, our army, chauffeuring American GIs to Hollywood movies at night. And then because he had such good foreign language skills and because he was such a nice guy, a Red Cross worker, an American Red Cross worker, recommended him to come to the United States on a visa, saying he would make a wonderful, loyal American citizen. And so he comes to the United States. He runs a Wise Potato Chip franchise. He marries an American woman. He has 2 American sons. He retires to Lake Carmel, New York, to this house along the lake. And that's when the Department of Justice realized who he was. When they eventually took him to federal court to strip him of his citizenship, this is what he looks like. And you can see he looks like an affable, ordinary, older man. And so right before the trial, the judge pulled the prosecutors inside and said, "Do you really want to go after this old man?" So it was an incredible uphill battle. And it's one of the questions in this book is, delayed questions of delayed justice. Is it too late to take someone on for crimes committed when they were young?
And there's that, and I also can't think of it, but think of Hannah Arendt's The Banality of Evil, you think that evil has a particular look to it, and yet it's us, and that's,
Yes.
and that's what that judge saw in Reimer,
That's right. And in fact, one of the prosecutors, Eli Rosenbaum, I don't know if you know the name Eli Rosenbaum, who worked with Elizabeth Holtzman for years and is still at the Justice Department, his first impression was that Jacob Reimer looks like a babysitter. He would have hired him to watch his kids. And it's hard. There was another prosecutor in this department named Ned Stutman, who died very young of cancer. And Ned Stutman used to go home and say to his wife, "I know I'm doing the right thing, but am I doing the right thing?" How it's hard because these looked like ordinary Americans. And so many years had passed. In many cases, their wives, children, and grandchildren had no idea what these men had done, years earlier. Jacob Reimer, in fact, participated and admitted participating in a shooting operation outside of Lublin where they rounded up Jews by the truckload. They brought them into the woods, and they had spread planks across a ditch in the forest, and they shot truckloads of Jewish men, women, and children. Jacob Reimer was leading a platoon of Travniki men during this mass shooting operation, and he acknowledged shooting at a man who was in the ditch, pointing to his head, almost as if he were begging for mercy. He wanted to be put out of his misery. So Jacob Reimer admitted to shooting at the man. And even with that confession, and even with all the documents that showed how he had loyally served the Third Reich from the beginning of the war to the very end, it still took a judge 4 years to decide to strip Jacob Reimer of his citizenship. By then, he was older, And the people inside the criminal division thought the judge was just biding his time to give Reimer a peaceful death here in the United States. And that's exactly what happened. He died in Pennsylvania in 2005, before the Justice Department could find another country willing to take him back. Germany said no.
What was the most difficult scene to recreate, both on an emotional level and also on a reporting level?
That's also a great question. I mean, every time I talk about Felix and Lucinda, I start to cry. I mean, every time I talk about him dying, and then Lucinda following 6 months later, it just touches my heart. So I'll tell you, in general, it's not easy to write about historians. They're very fact-based, dates, geography. And I kept saying, but how did that make you feel? But how did that make you feel? It's very hard to get historians to tell you that because they're very much about pure facts. So there were a number of scenes that I had to kind of pull it out. One thing I learned about writing a book like this is that even though I know in my head how I want the book to go, you have to go with your best scenes, what people can remember, what documents can support, right? Where your reporting takes you, and you have to be able to pivot because it's sometimes hard to recreate scenes because memories aren't always what we hope they would be. So a lot of the conversations with historians were a little bit difficult, but ultimately I spent about 150 hours interviewing them. And then what they couldn't tell me, I recreated on my visits to Poland and to Travniki. Those are those white gloves that I told you about, finding those original Nazi rosters. You can see Jacob Reimer's name on there under number 16. So I was able to recreate. That's what Travniki looks like today. No memorial, no real memorial, just a little bit of a plaque, but really no sense of what went on there. One of the worst things that happened at Travniki, this might answer your question because this was a hard scene to recreate, is after the ghetto Jewish uprising in the Warsaw Ghetto, the famed Jewish uprising in 1943, Heinrich Himmler decided not to risk any more uprisings. He wanted to kill the remaining Jews of occupied Poland right away. And so he called this secret operation Operation Harvest Festival. Ironic, horrible name. And so at Travniki and 2 nearby camps, they rounded up all the men, women, and children, and they shot them in an open field in a single day. It was the largest mass shooting operation in a single day in the history of the Holocaust. At Travniki and 2 or 3 other camps, more than 40,000 Jews were shot. And that was a hard scene to recreate for obvious reasons. So when I went to Travniki, I wanted to see what was there to remember this. Nothing, very little, very tragic.
Well, if there are no other questions, I have one final one for you, which is it has nothing to do with your book, but what have you read recently that you would recommend for us?
Oh my goodness. I just read, what was the book that's #1 nonfiction bestseller, The Birds Singing. What was it? No?
The nonfiction or fiction?
Nonfiction. She just won 1 million awards for it in the Bayou in Louisiana. I just read that. I loved that. That's fiction? I thought it was a biography.
Sarah Bloom.
Really?
Wait, which book is this?
Where the Crawdads Sing.
Yeah, that's fiction. Yeah.
Oh, all right. Sorry, I thought it was nonfiction. Sorry. I loved it. It was fabulous.
Just like a nonfiction writer to think those novelists are really writing the truth. Yeah.
It was so good. I read everything Bob Woodward writes. I read Kate Boo, which we talked about, and fiction. I love Pat Conroy and his stuff. And yes.
Well, thanks so much,
Thank
Debbie.
you.
Yeah, it's been a treat.
Yeah.